Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kaija Schilde. I am the director for the Center for the Study of Europe here at Boston University and a Jean Monnet Chair in European Security and Defense. And as part of that, we have programming around the topic of European security. So today I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Daniela Schwarzer, the Pierre Keller Visiting Professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and also the Executive Director for the Open Society Foundation Europe and Central Asia. Prior to Open Society Foundation, Dr. Schwarzer was the CEO of the German Council on Foreign Relations. She is a renowned expert in European affairs and transatlantic international relations, and we are eager to hear what she has to say, particularly around Russia's war on Ukraine and the European response to the war. So welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll start with a few introductory thoughts, and then I'm really keen to get into a conversation with all of you. So, yes, I think I would start by outlining what the beginning of the war meant for Europe. I'll focus a little on Germany, and then I will also look at the global repercussions of the war, and essentially share some thoughts how the EU has responded and will still have to respond, because this is ongoing and the challenges are not going away for the moment. So when I say beginning of the war, I mean beginning of this phase of the war, February 24th, when Russia started attacking Ukraine. But of course, we have to acknowledge that 8 years prior, Crimea was annexed and Russia had been intervening militarily in Ukraine's east. So there have been ongoing military interventions in the country. But generally, and that's why I refer to it as the beginning of the war, it's mostly in the European minds that this was a new war that started. And the first important thing to notice is that Europe's assumptions about its security order were shattered. One could argue they were shattered in 2008 when Russia intervened in Georgia, and they were shattered when Russia annexed Crimea and started the war on the Donbass. But it was really this February that there was a general realization that the assumptions upon which European security is built would no longer hold. What does that mean? It means that obviously policies in the national context need to be adjusted. It also means that the issue of European defense cooperation, from the perspective of some, but not of all, gained new importance in the European debate. But it also meant that the US returned, really, in a much bigger way to Europe as a security actor. Of course, it was always there, despite Trump's rhetoric of disinvesting from NATO. This didn't actually happen during the 4 years of his presidency. But what we now see is that the US is not only present financially and supporting Ukraine and delivering arms, but also did a lot of political work prior to the beginning of this phase of the war in bringing Europe basically onto the same page with the US in terms of risk analysis, in terms of threat analysis, and in terms of response. What happened very quickly after the beginning of this phase of the war was that Europe agreed on major sanction packages. And here is a notable difference to what happened 8 years earlier, when it really took a very long time until the first sanction packages, when Crimea was annexed, were decided upon by Europeans. There was no consensus at the time that this was the right thing to do, and there was hope and the expectation that other ways would help solve the issue. While it was seen as an illegitimate annexation, there wasn't this immediate counter-reaction. It only came when the plane flying from Amsterdam to Malaysia was shot down. So this was very different. It was also very different how the US actually shared intelligence about the war building up, the troops building up, and really trying to bring Europeans to a realistic assessment of what kind of threat Russia is. So you could see that there was a high frequency of US visits to Berlin, to Brussels, to other places, even before the public intelligence sharing started. And this really led to major political or policy revisions by some governments. I remember conversations still between German policymakers and American policymakers only a few weeks before the attack started on whether Germany should stop Nord Stream 2 as the second pipeline bringing gas from Russia to Germany. And the assumption then in Germany was that this was actually a way of making ties closer and bringing Russia closer to Europe and more dependent. I mean, we were getting more dependent on Russian gas, but Russia was likewise getting more dependent on Europe as an export destination. So the whole thinking was the closer those economic and energy ties are, the better it is for stability on our continent. And the American perspective, and also not only the American, but also the Baltic and Eastern European perspective on this particular project, and the underlying assumptions about what this means for ties with Russia was very different from the German one. So just 3 days after the beginning of the war, the decision was made to actually not open the pipeline. So this went very quickly, and I'm emphasizing that it's so quickly because it goes without saying this was well prepared. It was prepared by pressure from the US, which was there before the troop buildup started, but it was really a long way of working with the German government to reassess its options. I'll briefly shed more light on what actually happened on that day, 3 days after the beginning of the war in Germany. The Chancellor held a special session in the German parliament and gave a long speech which he called the Zeitenwende speech, which means basically the change of an era. And I don't take this idea of Zeitenwende, the change of an era, as a title for the policy change, but it's really the realization that the context has fundamentally changed. So I've spoken about security, I've spoken about energy. The missing piece is, of course, what does it mean for defense and security policy from a European perspective? I'll take Germany to illustrate what happened, because that's the most radical change we have seen among all EU member states. Now, Scholz, the Chancellor, actually in his speech introduced a 180 degrees turn on Russia policy. So for energy, this meant not only stopping Nord Stream 2, but also announcing an end to fossil energy imports from Russia. He then wasn't very precise, but he said this is the goal. We want to end energy dependency on Russia. He reaffirmed a decision which had been taken about 48 hours earlier, that Germany would export arms to Ukraine. That's a big issue for Germany because we have rules, which of course can be interpreted, but rules and of good tradition, that unless there's a very exceptional case, Germany does not export arms into conflict zones, so into wars or other areas of conflict. And this was also changed. And the final piece was that the German government committed not only to finally fulfill the 2% NATO defense spending targets, 2% of GDP, which all NATO states committed to 8 years earlier at the Wales summit, just as a reaction to the annexation of Crimea. Germany never complied with that goal, moved very, very slowly towards it. But then came the moment where he said, this year, we'll do it. This was made possible because the German government put up an extra fund of 100 billion euros, which is supposed to do three things, basically. One is to support the modernization of the German army, which is in dire need. The situation of our military is very bad, not to say dysfunctional in many ways. Secondly, to invest into a more modern military, so to have big German armament projects. And the third dimension, which isn't fully spelled out yet, is to use some of the money to bring forward European defense cooperation by creating an extra demand, but which could then go to European projects. This last part is missing. That's why there's a lot of question marks around at the moment whether Germany at the end of the day uses this money simply to become the biggest security player in its own right in Europe, because now we have the largest defense budget. We are, of course, not a nuclear power like France, but still the biggest defense spender, and whether this would really happen in a European logic. There was one important detail in the announcement on Germany's defense policy, and that was the commitment to buy American fighter jets that would be operational very quickly to be part of Germany's share in nuclear sharing. So the French took that with a lot of surprise because Germany previously had helped put on track a European fighter jet project, FCAS, but which obviously will only deliver many years later down the lane. But again, there was a lot of irritation when Germany announced to buy American fighter jets on that day. There was immediately a question mark, but what does this mean for the European project? So it was explained quickly afterwards that this is just to bridge the time, because the development of a fighter jet takes 15 to 20 years, had been decided 2-3 years prior, so it's a long development time. But you can see from those reactions how sensitive this new German role as the major defense spender in Europe, and a country that is of course deeply committed on the one hand to transatlantic security, but had also supported European defense efforts in the years prior, how this was seen by all sides as something really new and possibly changing the equilibrium in the EU, where Germany never took the lead on defense. And so those questions to some extent are still open, and part of the, I think, the Franco-German tensions that you can read about in the news today, with two cancelled meetings, one on the government level, the other one on the parliamentary level, in just 1 week's time. It's all, I think, an expression of a political situation in Europe where, on the one hand, everything is crisis-driven, and in crisis situations, people or governments tend to look after themselves first. But there are also fundamental differences in interest on some key policy areas, and one of them is, of course, energy. I'll briefly explain a little more of those dynamics. And that is that the German situation was, before the beginning of the war, that the previous government decided to leave nuclear energy, and so saw gas as a kind of bridge energy, as we call it, to bridge the time until renewables can take over a large share, if not all, of energy production. And so leaving fossil energy imports from Russia in that situation means you have to replace this somehow without being ready to use renewables. But there are, of course, climate targets to fulfill. So what happens right now, not only in Germany but in Europe overall, is really a big struggle to fill those gaps that the end of fossil energy imports from Russia leaves. Part of this is replaced by other sources, like Norway, which is a very welcome one because it's a democratic neighbor. The US is another source, so LNG will go up in its share in gas used in Germany and Europe, which is a problem because it is more expensive. And because of transport, because of LNG being more expensive than Russian gas as such, and also because of the huge investment needs, because we have to build the terminals first. 2 of them will be floating terminals off the German northern coast. But that's not cheap, and it has to happen very quickly to be effective. The extension of nuclear has been decided, but not for years, but simply for 3-4 months. In April, they will go off the grid. While France, which is the major nuclear energy producer in Europe, has lost half of its nuclear power plants because of technical problems and a lack of water to cool. And so right now, France imports electricity from Germany, which is produced with natural gas, which is, of course, if you look at the logic of that energy mix, is complete irony of this whole thing. So then Germany is waiting for the winter where it will very probably import nuclear energy from France. I mean, electricity produced with nuclear energy in France, while we say we leave nuclear because we don't think nuclear is a safe technology and not a green technology. So I'm giving you these anecdotes because it shows you how deeply intertwined the energy market is, but also how difficult it is at this moment to reconcile 3 goals. One is energy security. We simply don't want to freeze in winter. The other one is we want to green our energy production, but it's very difficult to do so at this moment in time because we are dependent on China for much of the solar and wind technology. We've lost it all almost in Europe, so this is another authoritarian dependency which we don't like having. So the goal of greening, the goal of energy security, and then the goal of having a reasonable price. This is of huge importance for Germany for basically one big reason. Not because when we look at our competitors, we now have suddenly a much higher energy price. No, because energy markets are Europeanized, at least to some extent. So with many of our direct competitors on the European continent, I'm not saying we're doing fine, but in a way, we all digest the same price increase, right? The problem for the German production side is that our share in gas, or the needs in gas for industrial production, is comparatively higher because of the structure of our industry, chemistry being one of the industries that consumes a lot. So there's a real risk of losing the major chemical industry production sites from Germany to other places. And the places where this can then likely go is not only the US, but also Asia. And it's there that the variance of the energy price really matters, because compared to Asia, the energy price in Europe right now is much higher. So it's not that Germany is singled out, but I wish to explain that we have a particular problem because of the high gas intensity of our industry. That makes part of the debate so complicated and such a hot political topic. Because in a general economic downturn, the government is very afraid to lose jobs. And if I just take one example to illustrate the point, one of the big chemical companies in Germany is BASF. Huge production in the US, huge production in Germany, building a huge site in China. Now, that one is the most modern and most effective and efficient one. And that's where the energy is cheapest. So it's almost a no-brainer to see that eventually more of what was initially happening in Germany may move there. And so the pressure on the government is very high, and the concerns of the economic repercussions of the war in that sense are very, very high. I'll briefly come back maybe to the security and defense dimension with which I started, the way the war is being looked at and what it means for Europe in the long term. Now, there's hardly any hope at the moment that there can be a quick negotiated solution to the war. The reason being that the goals of both parties in the war are not reconcilable. Russia wants to end Ukraine as a sovereign country and as a nation and as an identity. That's the goal of their war. It's not about a bit of territory, but it's about extinction of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, whom they want to be Russian. And Ukraine is defending exactly that. It's their identity. It's not a bit of territory, but it is the survival of their country and nation. And so, while there were moments in the war since February where it seemed like there could be an opening, that the Ukrainians would be willing to compromise on certain territorial agreements, like, for instance, not fighting to get back Ukraine or making a compromise on the Donbas. I think the situation has now moved well beyond that. The reason being that with the discovery that Russia was actually committing genocide, or what I think at some point lawyers will prove to be genocide, it's obviously a term that one can't just use, but the evidence is building up that there's genocide going on in terms of killing civilians, doing everything to make language, identity, education, everything disappear, kidnapping children and bringing whole villages to Russia and trying to re-educate them. All that is happening on the ground in Ukraine these days. A lot of sexual violence. I already spoke about the killing of civilians. And this has hardened the Ukrainian position in saying it's not about a bit of territory, and it's not about changing borders with violent means. It's about protecting our country and our identity and our nation. And this is why at the moment, when you talk to both, I mean, to Russians one can't really speak at the moment, or only very few people can, but when you speak with Ukrainians, you see that the position has really hardened, and Zelensky, the president, has gone as far as today saying he wants everything back, including Crimea. And that is probably one of the most sensitive points from the Russian perspective, not only because in Putin's narrative, Crimea is really the, is really what he argues most easily as Russian, but it's also from a military strategic perspective, a big port, which is in the Black Sea, which is basically their access to a strategically important sea. So that's why I think we are in for a long war. Right now, over the past few weeks, there has been a lot of escalation. After the explosions on the bridge to Crimea, which half damaged it, the Russians escalated, now almost every night bombing civilian infrastructure, mostly energy. Right now, 30% of Ukrainian power plants are damaged to an extent that they can't be easily repaired. More and more, residential buildings, schools, anything that is civilian infrastructure is being attacked. In terms of territorial gains, the Ukrainians have won back a number of villages. That really was a surprise success. But Russia has dug in, thanks to support by the Wagner Group, along the line of the Donbas, where they have really, over the past days even, dug themselves literally into the ground and built new defense lines, which I think all looks like there will be a very bloody war going on there. I didn't even mention the mobilization of soldiers in Ukraine, in Russia. That's also going on. Not that they are well trained and equipped at all, but it is going to be, huge human losses on both sides. And of course, the fear is there that the escalation goes as far as using weapons of mass destruction. And that is where now NATO comes in as a player with a very clear signaling, first from the US side, then just now today from the American, British, and French side together, what kind of reaction Russia needs to expect if it goes that far. And the threat is, the one we publicly know of, maybe there's more behind closed doors, is the destruction of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, which technically seems to be feasible within days, but which is a clear escalation because it would mean Americans bombing Russian military installations. So that's where we are. So everything I've told you about policy shifts and difficult trade-offs to make is nothing that is just a problem of this year. But I think we are seeing lasting structural changes. We will see a lot of loss and devastation. We see an economic crisis and a real need to keep a clear eye on what is at stake beyond Ukraine in that war. Because Russia's rhetoric, or Putin's rhetoric, for years now has been that it's not about Ukraine only. It's about rebuilding Russia as it used to be, and he equals that with the Soviet Union, more or less. And so even EU countries such as the Baltic states feel deeply threatened by this war. And we see a lot of movement within the EU to move closer together. We see NATO growing. So we really see maps of unions and alliances and communities redrawn in reaction to the war. And the big thing for Europe is, of course, how does the rest of the world position itself? China is key here. We can discuss China a little. Maybe you have views on that too, but it's not a done deal yet. There are tendencies in both directions. China intensifying ties with Russia and at the same time being critical of the recent escalations of the war. But for Europe, it's essential where China lands on this, also because if, in addition to Russia as a cheap energy provider, Europe loses China as one of, second to the US, trading partners and investors in Europe and the other way around, the adaptation of our model will be even more encompassing. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you so much. So I actually had thought about asking you large conceptual questions, but some of what you've been talking about, I'm going to selfishly ask a series of political strategic questions about German public discourse or elite discourse right now. Because I try to keep up and read German media, but I'm not keeping up fast enough right now. And so I'm deeply curious about 4 or 5 details. One, specifically your comment about structural reliance of the chemical industry on potentially foreign direct investment in China, if I'm following that correctly. That is something I hadn't really been following or hearing about. And does that help me then make more sense of Olaf Scholz's speech last week, where he reinforced, he said, yes, we have a Zeitenwende, but we are deepening our commercial, our handel with China, and we're going to have a deeper relationship with China. And I thought that was an interesting comment for him to essentially double down on the German-China relationship last week. And I couldn't really piece together the causality there. So is that part of it?
It's part of it, of course. So there are several elements. First of all, he's planning to visit Xi Jinping for the first time early November. So it's his first visit there as chancellor, and there hasn't been a state visit since the beginning of COVID. And obviously, Merkel went there 13 times in her tenure. So that's something German chancellors do. Why do they do that? Because there are very close economic ties. And a lot of discussion has been going on. Should this visit happen at that point? Should it happen after the G20? Should there be a kind of European delegation? But at the end of the day, I think it's going to be the German chancellor visiting with a German corporate delegation, as it always is. On the one hand, I think it's legitimate that he does that, but on the other, it is very important not to give others the impression that on this topic, also, with all the others I've already discussed, Germany is going it alone. It is not only German companies present in China, like the BASF example, which I just gave you. In that segment of industry, it's also the German car industry, which at the end of last year stepped up their investment in China, although they know it's probably only for a number of years, because the Chinese automotive industry also in e-mobility is catching up a lot. And so I think it's an attempt, I would almost say, to hold what we still have, knowing that China is developing so quickly, on the one hand in a for China positive way, because it's gaining competitiveness in more complex tech, digital, but also automotive and other industries. But it's also that China, step by step, is pursuing its vision of being more self-sustained and more autonomous. So actually we have to expect that in a few years' time there will also be a turning away of China from us. Right. So it's not, I mean, there's a lot of discussion right now, how do we think about economic ties with authoritarian regimes? But it's also how do authoritarian regimes think about economic ties with us, right? And so when Russia gets sanctioned heavily by Europeans and Americans, of course China thinks about how would we get sanctioned if we tried to grab Taiwan. And the American, messaging is very clear. There would be very important, measures to try and protect Taiwan. So from a Chinese perspective, and here I'm of course guessing, but I think it's logical to look at the Russia example and to think through, how do I enlarge my scope of action in foreign policy if I want to do things that others will not approve? And that means loosening ties, because then the costs you have to bear are by definition lower, because sanctions don't hit you that hard. Right.
So is there a discussion then, a strategic level discussion, about whether Germany is repeating the same mistake or a similar mistake that it made with energy in reliance on renewables, on elements in the supply chain, especially for renewables, or other aspects of what the new economy might look like with China?
Yeah, it's not so much repeating, because we're already there. Yeah. So it's a parallel development. We build both dependencies in parallel. And so the question now is how to deal with both at the same time. And what's the price you can bear? And what are the adaptation costs you can digest at which moment in time?
So I have two more questions that I'm going to ask, just to signal to everyone that I really want to hear audience questions. But I'm also deeply curious and selfishly curious about a few other things. So another thing you mentioned was the German defense budget, this
Yes.
100 billion euro increase. And I'm always fascinated by these kinds of things because you could just spend 100 billion euros by giving everyone's raises. You could spend 100 billion euros by making some recreation centers and officer quarters, or you could spend 100 billion euros on equipment, and then you could spend 100 billion euros on certain kinds of equipment, right? And so I'm so fascinated by this debate because Germany is a little bit of a exceptional case when it comes to defense, but European states were reforming their militaries in the last 20 years, but towards capabilities like counterinsurgency in Afghanistan or light expeditionary forces, which is not exactly the kind of capability that if you have a revisionist large power geopolitical neighbor. And so I would just like to invite you to help me understand more of the strategic debate about what that 100 billion might be going towards if Russia is this threat, and if that's the question, and from a military point of view.
Yeah, so I mean, territorial defense is back as an issue, and Germany now puts out the largest sum, but in terms of strategically and quickly investing, the Poles are much quicker. So Poland is now really becoming the most powerful territorial army on our continent, and they had anticipated this earlier, but there's also a huge push there. So I would say the setup of our military across the continent is really changing. And it's now much more about defense than it is about missions abroad. Also, there are huge catch-ups to be made in the area of cyber defense, where the attacks have increased since, again, the beginning of this phase of the war. They peaked also after the annexation of Crimea, so that's known. But there is likely to be more. And the third element, because you asked for sort of where the debate is, now it's all about infrastructure protection and resilience of energy networks and anything else, because there were two very recent attacks in Germany, one on the railway and another one on Nord Stream 2, which was actually kind of bombed under the water. And those, I mean, the lasting damage, obviously, for the pipeline is there, but it wasn't used anyway, so it doesn't cause any immediate extra problem. But the signaling of those in the domestic debate is huge, because people realize, oh, we always talked about vulnerability. Here we are. It's seemingly so easy. You can just stop all trains in northern Germany by cutting 2 cables. Anyone can do that, right? So the sense of vulnerability, this need to invest in critical infrastructure protection, but also the question of civilian preparedness and how do we, in real emergencies, are we equipped to handle those across the country? That's also part of the debate, maybe less public, but of huge importance in Berlin at the moment.
And that is a separate budget item, actually.
Yeah.
That's more internal security.
Indeed,
yeah.
indeed. However, the cyber part is, because often, critical infrastructure is also attacked through cyber.
So will the LNG terminals and the floating ones be guarded with ships?
Well, I think, I think they will be at least closely monitored. Yeah, of course.
Wonderful.
Daniel Petrovich, Central European University. Thank you so much for your talk. We've been mumbling a lot here. We have had many reactions. Could I ask briefly for your take on the territories in between? Meaning, what would be the German take on democratic backlash in Hungary, in Poland, in Italy now, basically, and also within NATO, Turkey, and so on? So how did this situation reflect itself on that problem?
Should we take more?
Yes, let's do a collection of 3 at a time, please.
Thank you for your summary and your selfish questions. I'm interested in the state of this is an accelerated conversation in Europe and now also between Germany and Eastern Europe. I'm interested in that conversation. What is Eastern Europe, loosely speaking, having to take on board from Germany and the reverse?
Those go well together. Can I take a third question? Okay.
I can give one more. I think we've talked a lot about the micro level or the tactical changes in the short term in response to the war in Ukraine, but surrounding the discourse around strategic autonomy, creating a European army independent from the United States, but then in theory that discussion happens a lot in a theoretical basis, but then once faced with this, how in terms of grand strategy has it changed in terms of objectives?
Wonderful.
Thank you. 3 excellent topics. Okay, I'll start with, you said in-betweens. Well, they are really at the heart of the EU, which makes it so difficult, Poland and
Also
Hungary.
Western Balkans.
I'll move from the inside to the outside, I guess. So it's not only the war, it's really the change of German government that changed the German position, because the previous government with Merkel, who was in the same party family with Viktor Orban until he left, really missed an opportunity here early on, 10 years ago basically, to make it clear what is okay and what is not okay on a political level. So the government up to end of last year, so still Merkel times, would criticize the developments in terms of constitutional changes or the clampdown on media in Hungary, or the sort of, the way to get media under control through ownership structures and the clampdown on civil society and all of that, would see it critically, but would never use its political way to deal with that, but rather to delegate the process to the European Commission, which had its Article 7 and other ways of dealing with it. The better tool, obviously, is holding back money from the European Next Gen EU fund, which Hungary at this point doesn't get. I hope it doesn't get it, unless it really course corrects. And what we see now is, first of all, the German position is clearly, until Hungary and Poland comply with the rule of law provisions, they shouldn't get more money. And that's good. But the government we have now is also more engaged bilaterally, and also not only with the governments in both places, and Poland is a huge problem at the moment because the bilateral relationship is very complicated, but also tries to engage more with civil society actors and others, or opposition in the countries themselves. And that's a big change. Merkel didn't do that, and it was a mistake, I think. Now, moving a little further, Western Balkans. So there's new engagement. There is the Berlin process meeting in Berlin, I guess. Is it next week? I think it's next week, November, maybe the week after, November 6th or so. So what is that? That's an attempt to bring together leaders from the Western Balkans, a bit of civil society as well, to discuss about regional integration while accession negotiations are going forward. And that's good. Germany always, over the past years, Merkel's government as well, tried to push the opening of negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania. And it was really the French and the Dutch and a few others that blocked, and the government in Berlin was furious about this. But now this is sort of on track. The big question mark is how the Berlin process and the so-called Open Balkans initiative can be brought together, which is essentially 3 countries cooperating on regional integration, and that's Serbia, that's Albania, and that's North Macedonia, with Bosnia and Kosovo not being in. And to be very frank, the German government sees this as an operation much in the Serbian interest, because it's relatively the biggest player, and Kosovo is not part of it. And so it sees it as not an ideal development. And it will be very interesting to see whether both initiatives can actually be brought together when the Berlin process meets. Final point, maybe, the European political community, which is a new thing that came about on French initiative, which I see as an attempt to structure the EU's relationship with its neighbors in a better way, in a more holistic way, in a more geopolitical way, and on eyes level, because heads of state and government for the first time have met in Prague, and there wasn't the ins and the outs, but it was just 43 heads of state and government meeting to discuss certain topics ranging from security to energy in 4 round tables and in smaller groups, larger groups, and so on. And this is the beginning now of a process which will be held again in April, probably next year, in the Republic of Macedonia. No, the Republic of Moldova. Moldova, thank you. The government there and the president there was very keen to have it there. Also because it is one of the countries next to Ukraine which, in my view, suffers most from Russian pressure, in that case through energy and possibly through forced migration. And it's very important, and that's really for me the main achievement that this thing can bring the European political community. It is that if it is used as a way to extend certain policies that the EU has put in place for itself and for accession countries, also to others, for which we have geopolitical reasons to do so, that is a positive achievement. The French were very, Macron put the idea forward, wanted this to happen, were very pushy in the beginning. The Germans were against it because they felt it dilutes other EU policies. But if we are very frank, I mean, European neighborhood policy, Eastern Partnership, all of these policies need a redesign anyway. They are not very effective. And I think this is a good addition. And after some reluctance, the government has now obviously bought into the process, but they, for a long time, hoped it wouldn't happen. So then I think the West and the East, or Germany and the East, was that the question? Yeah.
And Turkey and Italy.
Turkey and Italy. Oh my God.
And Iceland.
Yeah. Okay, so very quickly on Italy, I think, of course, huge shock with the electoral results. German newspapers, but I also see this in the English-speaking press, still like to call the government a center-right government, which I think shouldn't happen. But really, you can read that. We shouldn't pretend at all, and really look at what the government effectively will do. On Russia, the Italian Prime Minister is not where her 2 coalition partners are, so less Russia-friendly. And it's very important, I think, for other EU governments to make sure that Italy fully continues to subscribe to the sanction packages and doesn't change its position there. There's of course a temptation on energy for Italy to Germany, probably the country that has the most adaptation costs to the new energy security concerns, and so so Italy needs to be watched. There's some hope, with irony, that no Italian government in the past years lasted very long, so maybe we could just watch. No, but that's not a strategic approach. And Turkey, oh my God, I mean, no one believes that accession still, although Erdogan from time to time says so, on the EU side, this is simply no longer a real issue. Obviously, it's problematic to have a NATO partner that buys Russian, that doesn't take clear positions on Ukraine, but that is by some still seen as a potential negotiator. So it's a difficult relationship on many accounts. And I think also, from an alliance perspective, the fact that Erdogan is such an authoritarian ruler, how you deal with that in the long term in your defense alliance, difficult. So the elections will be key, but of course we have no illusions about those elections being free and fair. I mean, there's a lot to watch there as well.
Confrontation between Greece and Turkey?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an ongoing risk that it escalates. The Greeks have tried, obviously, to use the EU, to use Borrell, to use, of course, NATO, to show more solidarity with Greece than they did. But I think the provocation came more from the Turkish side. And if that continues, I think we will sit with that same problem within the alliance. So if it escalates, I think at some point, I don't think anyone from a strategic perspective wants to lose Turkey from NATO, despite all of what I've said, because it's better to have them in than out. But if this continues that way, I think at some point it's very hard to maintain. So the East, and so there's a lot of criticism of German policy in Europe's Eastern and Central European member states. So the Baltic states are extremely critical of what happened in terms of building so much energy dependency. Poland is very critical. That group of countries is also critical of Germany delivering too slowly with its armament procurement. And so what it committed to comes too late, and it doesn't commit to the right things. That's the general criticism, particularly eyeing German tanks, the famous Leopard, that this government doesn't want to deliver. And on top of that, we have a lot of bilateral Polish-German disputes going on around all kinds of things, from reparations to where should Ukrainians be trained in Germany or Poland in joint missions, and it's crazy. It just is not a constructive relationship at the moment at all. And the German government would like to change that, but also sees that if the peace government goes ahead and builds its electoral campaign on anti-German polarization, then there's really nothing much they can win. And from a peace perspective, this seems to be a pretty interesting option that mobilizes their voters. So it's going to be quite rough, I think, for the next 12 months probably. And then there was, I can't remember your
question about European strategic autonomy,
Oh,
I
yeah.
think, yes.
Like how would NATO and then how would the dynamic between NATO and then the Eurocorps or European Army developments change? And then I thought of a second question too about, we've talked about the East, but we also see Sweden and Finland abandoning their neutrality. What can you say on the changes in dynamics in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries in this environment?
Yeah, thanks. So let me start with European Defence Cooperation. So the initiative to really try and reach a new quality was taken in 2017, which was a response to Trump's doubts whether it's in the US interest to continue funding NATO and sticking to Article 5 guarantees, basically. That's the moment where Europe said, oh, we have to do more for ourselves, and an old term was used. It wasn't invented then. It was an old term, strategic autonomy, which had been in Council conclusions and a European strategy document beforehand. And so this whole narrative developed, we need to reach strategic autonomy. It wasn't meant against the US, because that would be a complete illusion, but it was interpreted as such by some within Europe and in the US. And so the fear was at that time among Central and Eastern Europeans, more than among Western Europeans, that it could actually be used by the Trump administration to justify disinvestment in NATO if Europe was heading for strategic autonomy. Of course, it never seriously did, because it's a very, very long time that will be needed to reach this, if at all feasible. So right now, what happens is that the war actually changed the perspectives of some countries on enhanced defense cooperation, and not in the sense that we need more, but that we actually need less, because America's back, because it's actually NATO that rules. The accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO seems to prove their point, that the relevant group of countries is NATO as an alliance and not the EU. And so those countries that actually want more European defense cooperation now find themselves in opposition to Central and Eastern European countries who want more transatlantic cooperation. What's the reason that they have that position? I think there are two. One is the geographical location closer to Russia and the war, which makes them even more, aware of our dependency on US security guarantees and active support. And the second reason is that their procurement is essentially American. So that goes not only to Central and Eastern Europe, but also to Southeastern Europe, so Romania, Bulgaria, and others. They buy American, and they really have a very low interest to replace this in any way with European armament or anything. It's really, they don't see a sense, and they are very happy in the transatlantic alliance, and they don't in any case want to have less favorable conditions in buying American. So for them it's a, it's almost now, the war has proven what they've been saying all along. We are part of NATO, we buy within the alliance, that's American, that's what we want to keep. So I would say the EU will make, because of the war, not more progress on its own defense cooperation, but less. For your question, how does this relate to NATO? I think that problem is, it's maybe not solved in all practical detail, but the conceptual problem is solved in the sense that no one now believes this is against NATO, but that it is about building, if at all, something European as part of NATO. That reflection is there. The practical cooperation between the European Defence Agency, the way the European Defence Fund is used, all that is now totally NATO compatible. And there's a lot of exchange on the military level as well. So I think that thing is solved practically. But in terms of what weight would that European pillar within NATO have, I don't think it will be so big as one might expect if you have a war on your own continent.
In the case of NATO, what is NATO composed of? What responsibilities do they have? When a member nation, Turkey, ganged up with Azerbaijan and attacked Armenians, that was covered up.
Yes.
And they got away with that. I really feel they were trying to get Russia to fight them. Now, Putin can't really get back at the drones. That's been his problem. So he refrained from taking part. If he had taken part to fight with the Armenians there, that would have created. In other words, what is NATO doing other than being used by the United States to do their dirty work?
Thank you.
John Martin, former Army officer, prospective student at BU. Thanks for your time today. A follow-up kind of on that question with respect to NATO in terms of, it seems that Russia has the nuclear capability, and then they have the low-end, more terrorist-type capability like sabotaging pipelines. Anything in the discourse in Germany or in Europe broadly in terms of triggering an Article 5, given that it seems that they're not as much of a conventional threat as we thought. And then also in terms of any visibility and weakening of the position of the anti-nuclear position, given that if this energy problem is not solved, it empowers Putin, and it also empowers far-right political parties in Europe. So, two-part question.
I see two more questions too. I'm just going to take all of them so we can.
Yes,
then you can kind of. All right, we'll take all the questions. Here we go, Joe.
Obviously, I think at some time there's going to be a negotiation.
At some point.
War.
Long out.
Can you negotiate with Putin? This guy's out and out assaulted another country. If you can't, obviously it'd be great if he wasn't there, you could negotiate with someone else. But would there a possibility of some kind of intermediary? What do you see would be the tipping point to a negotiation? That's one question. The other, how much longer can you permit the Russians to basically have a safe haven to attack points in Ukraine without firing back at that safe haven? They've done a little of it, and it's not completely gone. But I wonder how you think this is going to end. And finally, how autarkic can we become? How less dependent can we become in a world that's seen nothing but more and more interdependence in the last, half a century? So that's just my question.
Okay, those were meaty questions, so I'm going to cut it off
Yeah,
at
I'm
the
just
3, and then we have
breathless.
2 more. Those were heavy. I don't envy you having to engage in such great questions, but yes, we'll stop there for now.
Can only be a start, I suppose. So what is NATO for? I think NATO at this moment is, if you look at what happened over beyond the war, right? I mean, what happened before NATO started working on a China strategy? NATO is working on a space strategy, or has one by now. So I think the alliance is moving away from this idea of defending countries and their territories, but it's moving to other areas where warfare is happening, and cyber is one of them. And from, I think what we see more and more is that, and also I'd love to hear whether that's true, I'm observing this as a German looking at the American perspective, obviously is being part of a global policy led by the US, which is about the systemic competition between authoritarian states and democracies, where NATO, in a way, is the alliance of democracies, which makes the problem of Turkey even more salient within NATO. So not only from the question of how is it tactically using its position within NATO for its own goals, but also from a conceptual perspective, how do we deal with an alliance of democracies that has gone as far as building a, part of them globally, building a security alliance, which now starts to look at global issues where others also have an interest in. So a NATO-China strategy, of course, is also discussed with allies in the Indo-Pacific, where the US has a far bigger presence than Europeans, for instance, have. So I would say that at the moment, from a European perspective, NATO is mostly relevant for our own defense, yes, but it is going to be the forum where more global questions of security will be discussed in the future. And from a European perspective, where we don't have the same strategic culture and outreach and engagement as the US, this is our chance to be part of the conversation, because we are not players in the Indo-Pacific where the US is big time. We are not in other regions of the world in the way the US is. So I think from Europe, from a European perspective, NATO gains more and more importance by seizing those other topics as well. There is no discussion on, there is a discussion, but at this moment, no chance for a decision to extend nuclear beyond April next year. So if it had happened, this would have been the moment now, because the decision of extending up to March or April was just taken. And interestingly, the coalition was under enormous tensions, because the Liberals, the smallest party in the coalition, was pushing for an extension beyond April, and with quite good arguments, frankly. So it can be that this is going to be revisited if there is no alternative. I'm not saying never, but it will be politically extremely costly for the two others, the Greens and the Social Democrats. And the longer we wait, the more costly that decision will be. So, you know, I don't think the problem is solved. So I'm not saying it's not going to be revisited. But right now, no one wants to hear that. So they try to kill the debate with a decision to end nuclear in April.
And then there was a question about negotiation and with whom on the Russian side.
Yeah, with whom? I mean, so I gave you my rather pessimistic view on chances for a window opening for negotiations with Putin. I think things would have to change on both sides, on the Ukrainian and the Russian, because they are at this moment so affirmative, one saying basically there's no legitimacy for this country to exist, and the other one saying we want you totally out, you know. And I think the first point where the Ukrainians would need to move, if they think it's in their interest to negotiate, is Crimea, to get some kind of extra whatever agreement, which they don't want. But if that's maybe the price to get at least a ceasefire, which is not yet a peace agreement, of course, that could open this. Otherwise, there's little we know about the stability of Putin and his entourage. But if he ever is pushed out of office, I'm not sure the alternative would be easier to negotiate with. So Russian experts do emphasize the risk of having an even more radical leader in the Kremlin. Or, as an alternative, a less strong leader, but a Russia which risks falling apart, which from a European perspective would also be a security threat. So, as much as I hope there is a window of opening for negotiations soon, I don't see it happening very soon, because the price that both sides will pay along the way, I think, has to increase until they are ready to negotiate. At least that's how I interpret the positions they take at the moment. They are hardening, not softening.
So I see there are another series of questions, and you're going to have to tell me when it's time, because. Oh, great. No, but I don't have a watch. Yeah.
It's 8 minutes.
Oh, well, you talked about a little bit the cyber attacks within Germany, but I'm just curious if you could comment, because my German's a little rusty and I don't follow the German media as closely, but what about disinformation? What is Russia doing in terms of disinformation there, and how that's affecting this question?
And then Vivian, I saw.
Yeah, so thanks for a wonderful set, not only remarks, but then responses to comments. So I actually had 4 questions.
Oh my God.
But
I don't have a pen.
you've already answered
Okay.
3.
Okay, good.
At great length. So there's just one, which is, where is the EU on energy policy? Because in your comments you talked about Germany, you talked about France, etc. But what is the EU, and what can the EU do to address these issues? And I'm also thinking about permanent debt. Yes, I know you laugh, and that was another part of the question, because given the German coalition, given Lindner in finance, I know that there's opposition to it. But if we think about the fact that Germany can certainly survive, it's the richest country in Europe for the moment, and France will be fine. But what about the other countries? So where is there some kind of EU solidarity, but not just EU solidarity, but capability?
And I'm going to, if we could just go quickly, I want to make sure everyone has a.
I'm an undergrad student, so appreciate hearing from you. I'm wondering about the general consciousness or conversation within Europe about a wavering American commitment to European security. We're approaching an election in the next 2 years, and I'm wondering if there's conversation within Europe about what a change in policy here would mean for Europe.
Thank you. And
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting how you presented this case. You mentioned Zeitenwende and talked about a strategic reorientation, because there was no strategy before, which is true, but I don't see there's any strategy now either. I mean, the Germans are selling Hamburg port to the Chinese. This is like the final piece in the Go strategy to take them all. And most importantly, I think, you're not talking, or have not talked about deepening versus enlargement. I mean, the enlargement discourse you gave us here is the common soft vanilla sauce that we get about European politics and policy makers. But the real strategic issue is the deepening. And I think that would be interesting.
Yes. I'll start with that point.
yes, and I think weave together
because
what
I
we
indeed
can.
forgot it, because we haven't heard so clearly as we did over the past month that the German Chancellor and the French Chancellor said, we will not enlarge without deepening. Both took a very firm position. That triggers the fear of those who now find themselves in the political community that this is, and are not EU members, that this is a second best option for them and they won't get in. And my personal view is you better take that than have nothing. So use it if EU policies are extended there, make best use of them, work towards accession, but you don't know whether you get it. And now the question of reforming the EU internally, I think, so you have the two major countries saying we need a reform of the EU, but you don't hear, here's the reform we want. Here's what we push for, right? And there was a moment where this could have happened. And that was when last year the Future of Europe conference is closed, which was a broad exercise to bring in all kinds of citizens and others to have a broad conversation on how Europe of the future could look like. And if you looked at all the recommendations that came out of this Future of Europe conference, There's part which can just be adopted by secondary law, so you can just, make policy, or you need to revise the treaties. And there was no consensus in the European Council to work on the treaty revisions. So in a way, you had a base of legitimacy to move ahead with a reform.
But it's still open.
No, they said no. Well, they said they don't want a convention. Yes. There was a European Council decision last May that they said no to opening a convention to further elaborate those proposals. So, if at all, if we take the German and the French government by the word, and they want treaty revisions, they will not want a convention, as it looks, unless they revise their positions, and they were very hard and clear. Then they can go into an intergovernmental conference and negotiate there. That's my reading of the state of decision making at the moment. Vivian, what can the EU do in terms of energy, and where's solidarity? I think that two questions here. In terms of energy, the most basic thing is to think about energy security in a more European way. The thinking has been done, the implementation is lacking in terms of trans-European networks or the connectors, so you can, if one country is hit, you can more easily share across borders. The thinking was done since the annexation of Crimea, so basically 8 years ago. This all started as a new topic in EU policy debate. How do we make sure energy is secure? And only a very small part of it was done. Right now the discussion goes beyond the EU, like Moldova and others. How could Moldova, if it loses, which it does, very likely loses Russian gas, and it loses electricity from Ukraine because the power plants are destroyed, how is Moldova actually kept afloat? And that's through Romania. And so there's a little bit there, but more in terms of infrastructure investment is needed. And this is now the new thinking, that actually those energy networks and the connectors and all of that is seen as a continental thing against Russia. There are several problems, so we discussed Hungary, Poland. I could add Serbia in the mix, because if you want to include the Western Balkans and you have one country that openly sides in a way with Putin and is highly dependent on Russian energy, doesn't want to take part in any sanctions, you have a problem. And that's going to be one of the problems of the European political community going forward, because there are a number of countries that, from a geopolitical perspective, are not with the EU. So, and then what else can the EU do? Procurement, well, joint energy purchases. This is coming, gas purchases. I think that's good. In my view, it should be extended to neighbors as well. And the whole discussion right now is the price cap issue, so regulating the price, which is much more difficult. And in terms of solidarity, when Olaf Scholz became Chancellor, I was a little hopeful that the German position could be more open than it was in the past, because he was the architect of the Next Gen EU Fund as finance minister. So he was essentially one of the architects together with the French finance minister to develop a big European extra budget to compensate for, COVID, basically, all the COVID repercussions. And the interesting thing about this thing is it's based on European debt raised in the markets collectively, and on the expenditure side, it's not only loans, but it's also transfers. And so this was a big thing for Germany to accept. It was in a crisis moment. Merkel got convinced, she said yes to it. And so my hope was that Scholz could do more of that. The coalition is such that it's not very likely, with the finance minister, as you said, who is clearly not in support of those ideas. But if the situation gets worse and the alternative is that the single market breaks apart, the higher, the costs would be enormous for Germany. So,
Thank you, everyone.
thank you.
Thank you.